Good afternoon. I'm Arunabha Ghosh. I'm the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. On behalf of Kiran Pastricha and the Aspen Institute and the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, we welcome you. Thanks for making time. In sort of the middle of the workday, we were trying to get a slot later, but as you know, in winter in Delhi, it's hard to get a venue, so we take whatever we get. Beggars can't be choosers. But it's a good reason to have come here. We've got Dr. Arun Majumdar, who until recently was directing the Advanced Research Projects Agency at the US Department of Energy, and prior to that, he was a professor at Berkeley. So before I hand it on to Dr. Majumdar and Mr. Suresh Prabhu, our chairperson, let me just give you a quick introduction to CEW for those of you who don't know us. We are an independent research institution chaired by Mr. Prabhu, and our objective is to integrate energy, environment, and water issues in all the research that we undertake, as well as the policy advisory work that we undertake for government within India and outside. On the energy side, we did the first independent analysis of the National Solar Mission. We've done work on industrial energy usage in India. We're working on reducing energy requirements in certain industries in India, as well as looking at long-term pathways for reducing carbon from carbon output from industry. We are looking extensively at off-grid energy systems and the financing that would be required to stimulate that market. We look at clean energy subsidies and what kind of global rules are needed to keep them in play without disputes arising. So some of you might have seen our publications. They're here for your viewing. But that should be enough from me. I just wanted to pass on the floor to Mr. Suresh Prabhu, former Union Minister of Power, Environment and Forests, Industry, Public Enterprises, Chemicals and Fertilizers. Also, he chaired the task force on interlinking rivers. In a sense, he has covered it all, energy, environment, and water. And I would request Mr. Prabhu to reflect on why the theme of today's talk, essentially the changing energy landscape, and how it is being shaped in some ways, is important. Before we pass on the floor to Dr. Majumdar, who's really been at the heart of it, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, about which Dr. Majumdar will speak in much more detail, has been the US government's leading institution to invest in transformational, game-changing, horizon or beyond the horizon technologies in the energy space. So I think we'll learn a lot from how that has materialized, how the politics of it has worked, how the financing of it has worked, and certainly how the technology of it has worked and is working. But before we move on to Dr. Majumdar, Mr. Prabhu, your reflections on the theme, sir.
So good evening to all of you. We are very happy that all of you could come, as my friend Arunabha said, at a very odd hours, because this is not a good time to have a discussion, because some of you must have left your work behind and come here. So thank you very much for doing that. We in India currently keep talking about one overarching issue which says that India is suffering from policy paralysis. So of course sometimes I wonder, when you say paralysis, means some other part of the body is working, because paralysis normally means that. But even if whatever it means, because I'm not a doctor in any case, but this paralysis or this lack of action on part of governments, it should not necessarily be now looked into as a contemporary issue. For a long time, we have ignored a very important aspect of a public policy which affects our national security, economic development, social issues, and that's the issue really speaking about how we should deal with our energy challenges. We have quite a few challenges there because most of our energy, particularly oil, is imported into India. There is more of gas to the gas issue because there's not really a gas coming out as much as we thought. But we really have a real big challenge there. And therefore, what we should really be looking at in India is how are we going to secure India's future in terms of making adequate energy available for our economic development, for removing social disparities, and ensuring that this energy that is available to us is available in a manner that will never make us compromise with any of our security concerns. And that's a major challenge for India. And we have talked about it for a long time, but not much action has been taken. Probably the only tangible action that we could see was preparing a comprehensive integrated energy policy, in which we could only say that how insecure we are in terms of, we are saying now our imports are going to increase from 65% currently to 85%. So that's the best we did. But not really addressing those questions that raised by the policy in terms of how are you going to do that? How are you going to get more security? So this is a major challenge for India. And in that, it's not just type of energy that we need. We cannot just get any form of energy to make this happen. Is also the other aspect of the challenge is the type of energy that we get, the type of energy we consume should not lead to make the world worse off than what it is today. And therefore, making a challenge addressed in a manner that we address the core challenge, but in the process we do not create any other issue. And that's what, really speaking, we are really facing the dilemma today. Making energy available, affordable rates, in a manner that is secure, but also it is sustainable really. And that's what we really are looking forward to now listening to Dr. Majumdar, whom I can see in the audience, some of my friends who were there in Washington, D.C., when for a brief time, Dr. Majumdar spoke about the future scenarios. And we are so impressed. It is like really peeping into a future. It was really not a science fiction movie that we are looking at when you talked about it, but it looked like that really if we move towards that scenario, how well we will be as a world. And therefore, I am really going to looking forward to it. For India, it's not an issue of India's energy future. The question is, without energy, do we have a future? And that's what really is a question that we need to address. And therefore, how do you actually make this happen is a major challenge for India. Some countries are very lucky, like USA, who have now discovered huge shale gas and also shale oil. China is going to have almost 40% of the projected shale gas reserves, so they are very fortunate. It seems that India has still not discovered gold in that respect. We are importing gold, of course, but not discovered that again. But now we really need to find out how, in that sense, these sources of energy which are known today are not available in abundance. What are those energy options for India as well? What could be done in this particular manner? Where should be our research and development really be focusing on? And how you can collaborate with global players to make that happen? These are some of the issues that we are going to be facing in the years to come. So I'm very happy that Dr. Majumdar, though was now a citizen of US, was Under Secretary in the Department of Energy, but was born in India, had lived in Delhi for some time, and also spent some time in Mumbai learning about many aspects of this energy issues. So I look forward to listening to him. Thank you very much once again for joining us. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, can you hear me at the back? Okay, very good. Well, first of all, let me thank Mr. Prabhu for your leadership in terms of energy, environment, and water. Sometimes we sort of split that apart into little buckets and try to solve them, but it is an integrated issue, and appreciate your welcome. I also want to thank Mr. Tarun Das and
Dr. Ghosh for inviting me and making all the arrangements. It so happens that my name is also Arunava, the full name, but I changed it to Arun just to avoid confusion with Dr. Ghosh. So I thought I'll give you some insights about a paper. I'll start with a paper that Secretary Chu, Stephen Chu, and I wrote right while I was leaving the Department of Energy. And it came out, and we took this opportunity. Nature came to us and said, can you write something? And I said, okay, let's collaborate and do something about it. And we put our sort of thinking about the snapshot. It provides a techno-economic snapshot of where the world is going in energy. And by the way, it does not cover some important areas like the grid. It does not cover energy efficiency. We could not cover it. It's a 10-page paper. And Nature said, we can't give you more space than that. And what we did was we called for a new industrial revolution in energy. The old industrial revolution is something that we should look at. When you call it industrial revolution, let's go back in history and ask ourselves, what happened in the industrial revolution? This is what happened. We called it the horsepower to horsepower. Because if you go back to the 1700s, we had animal power and human power. That's all we really had. And the Industrial Revolution has changed humankind like nothing else, because now we use not horsepower, but horsepower. A car is on the order of a few hundred horsepower. We go to the local market with 100 horses taking us there. We go across countries in high-speed train with 10,000 horses pulling us. And we go across continent in a few hours with 100,000 horses pulling us, where it used to take months to cross continents. That's what's going on. It's an amazing transformation of humankind. And not only mobility, our factories have been mechanized, our agriculture has been mechanized, and we live in homes that are lit and that are cooled and heated. So this is what we're talking about. The people in the 1700s could not have even imagined that we would be living a lifestyle like this today. So if you ask the question, what has changed? It has led to amazing economic growth. It's an exponential increase in GDP per capita, which is often considered a marker for economic progress and prosperity. So it's an exponential growth. But this has all come. The Industrial Revolution is all about how we utilize energy. Because if you look at the energy consumption, this is the map of energy consumption, and the blue is coal, the red is oil, the green is natural gas, and the rest of it is nuclear, hydro, biomass, solar, wind, etc. And in fact, the time scales is not the same in the two graphs. If you were to make the same time scale, which is this, you'll find it is an exponential increase. So GDP per capita and economic and use of fossil energy, which is part of the marker for the Industrial Revolution, they're extremely well correlated. Well, what else has changed? The world, so it's GDP per capita, but the number of people has exponentially increased. And this is the population of the world from Stone Age. And all the way down to, and you can see a little dip, which was the plague that happened. And before the Industrial Revolution, we had 700 million people in this world, and now we have 7 billion people in the world. So it's a factor of 10 increase. And the question is, where are we going in the future? And where we're going is the following. Today it's 7 billion. And by the way, that recent increase over the last 100 years from 1 billion to 7 billion has been because of technology. And that is what is called the Haber-Bosch process of making artificial fertilizers, where you take nitrogen from the atmosphere, it's a triple bond, and it is very hard to break the hydrogen triple bond, but they were able to do it to make ammonia. And ammonia became the precursor for artificial fertilizers, which led to avoiding famine and producing food to the level that can sustain 7 billion people. And if you're looking forward in the future, this is the United Nations study. The average is 10 billion by the end of this century. but the error bar is also 10 billion. So not exactly sure where that's going to go, but it all depends on the fertility of women, mostly in Africa. That's where it really comes down to. And nevertheless, let's just take 10 billion, so we're going to add 3 more billion people to this world before it sort of saturates. And the question is, if we are to keep that exponential growth, you need also then access to fossil energy, and do we have that fossil energy? And so here is now the oil, global oil reserves. And what you find is that there is no peak oil, because the technology for discovery and production has kept pace with the increase in the demand. And so now we are finding more and more oil. We go deeper and deeper in the ocean, and there is oil. And the bottom graph is, in the next 10 years, we find that we have an overcapacity for production, in which case there's a very good chance that the oil price, at least in the near future, is not going to go to $140 a barrel, but may actually come down or fluctuate. So this is now we have a lot of capacity to produce oil. The global gas reserves without US shale is the top one. That keeps increasing. And if you include the shale, it's an amazing, that's been a game changer in terms of the amount of gas that we have been able to, that we can access because of the discovery using horizontal drilling and fracking of shale gas. In fact, I can talk a little bit later on about it, but this is, which countries have shale gas, and you can find in the North America, China was mentioned, and all around the world, there is shale formation and there is accessible gas. In the United States, there are all these formations, Marcellus Shale, Barnett Shale, and up there in Canada, in Alberta and all, there's a lot of shale out there. Not all shale can be fracked, but many of them can be. And if you look at the EIA projections of how much technically recovered resource there is, you find China right up there in the front in terms of the amount of shale gas that can be recovered, and the United States is second, and so on and so forth. So there is enough. The bottom line is that there's enough hydrocarbons out there for economic growth to be sustained. But there are consequences to this, as we all know. I'm not going to talk about global warming, that the fact that the average temperature has gone up by 0.8 degrees over the average, over the past. That is well known. I think all scientifically, the literature has shown that this is clearly due to human activity and not a natural one. What has not happened is the following. If I go out on the street in Lodi Road, for example, and ask someone, okay, the global warming is 0.8 degrees has happened, what do you think? The person will probably say, who cares? 0.8 degrees, how does it affect me out here? And what has not happened in the past is the connection between the average and the edges of the distribution, the extremes. And I just want to show you a data that just came out in August of this year from Jim Hansen's group about that. And what I'll show is the following. This is the distribution, this is the Gaussian distribution. The horizontal axis is the standard deviation, normalized by standard. So 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma. And this is the summer temperature, 80s, 90s, 2000, okay, decades, all the way out here. So what you find is that this distribution of temperature, it's not the mean. The mean has only gone up by 0.8 degrees. But the tails of the distribution has surely shifted to the right. The tails of the distribution are now reaching 5 sigma of the original distribution, which is an extremely unlikely event, but that is what is going on. And the distribution is broadened, which means that we are now reaching extremes of temperature. Now this is still, the distribution is globally averaged, spatially averaged. The question is, where is this happening? And I'd just like to highlight where this is happening. This is, if you look at the bottom chart out there, you find that the brown is above 3 sigma and above, and the pink is minus 3 sigma and below. So you find 1955, 1965, 1975, that's been the distribution of these temperatures. How much deviation have you had? And the middle row is 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. And there's an unmistakable trend out here that you're getting to more brown than pink, okay, which is what you saw earlier. What you also see is that, look at the 2010 one, you find that there's this big hotspot near Eastern Europe, which was the massive heat wave that you had in Moscow. And in 2012, which the data is not yet there, you'll find there's probably a hotspot, the massive hotspot in the United States, because the Midwest states had probably one of the worst, it was the worst heat wave in the last 100 years, more than the 1930s, what is called the Dust Bowl time that was there in the United States. So these are the consequences that we are likely to face in the future, and this is not going to abate unless we do something about it. So you ask the question, okay, since we're talking about industrial revolution, since the beginning of the industrial revolution, how much CO2 have we actually emitted, cumulative, over the last 250 years? How much CO2 have we emitted? The answer is about 1 trillion tons. Okay, cumulative over 250 years, trillion tons. Then you ask the question, which is a valid question, how much more CO2 can we emit based on known fossil fuel reserves? Note that the known fossil fuel reserves are changing. We are finding more and more reserves. But based on known today, if you burn all those, the carbon, how much CO2 can we emit? And the number is about 3 trillion tons. So 3 times more than what we have emitted over the last 250 years. And you ask the question, given the economic growth and the carbon intensity and everything, how long will it take to burn all that carbon based on our current trends? And the answer is 75 to 100 years. Okay, in the next 75 to 100 years, we're probably going to burn all this CO2 given our current rate of use of energy, etc. So we will probably burn 3 times more carbon, produce 3 times more CO2 in 1/3 the time than what has happened in the past. So there you got a factor of 10 right out there. But here's the dilemma. So no one wants to do that, but here's the dilemma. The dilemma is that that carbon is worth tens of trillions of dollars. So here's the dilemma, is how can we ask someone to keep tens of trillions of dollars down there and not use it for economic growth? And that is the question everyone is facing. So I'm going to use a quote, and we used it in our paper. The Stone Age did not come to an end because we ran out of stones. This is Sheikh Ahmed Yamani, who's a former oil minister of Saudi Arabia. And we added in our paper, is because we transitioned to better solutions. Okay? We transitioned out of Stone Age because we found better solutions. And that's really the question we have to ask, is what are those better solutions in the future that is better than what we have today? And to do that, we have to really understand energy as a system. And there are many aspects to this system. One way to look at this is the following. That in energy system, there are 2 types. One is stationary power. We produce electricity, distribute in a grid, and use it mostly in buildings and homes and industry. And the second system is the transportation system, which is based mostly on oil and is used in vehicles, cars, trucks, etc., and planes. These 2 systems really don't interact with each other. At least today, they don't interact with each other. So we can consider them independently, which is a good thing. So that's one way to look at it holistically as a system. The other way to look at its system is that in each of those circles out there, there are technologies being developed and improved upon. And so you can take the 3rd and 4th dimension to this graph and look at it this way. That is, in every technology, in each of the circles, there's something called a learning curve. That in the y-axis and the vertical axis is cost of a technology over performance, and the horizontal axis is scale and volume. In energy, cost and scale is everything. You've got to be able to scale something. It has to be cheaper. The performance has to go up. So every technology goes down a learning curve. That means the more and more we do, the better we become. That means you have better performance and lower cost. And that's how you take air conditioners, batteries, coal-fired power plant, steam turbines. Everything goes through learning curves. And up front is technology innovation. Then you have manufacturing or scaling of those innovations, and finally deployment. So this is a learning curve, and just to map where the Department of Energy in the United States is, there are many applied energy programs like the Energy Efficiency Renewable Energy Program Office, Fossil Energy Office. Their job, the applied energy programs, their job is to use science and engineering to help technologies go down, current technologies go down a learning curve, which is evolutionary, which is extremely important. People think everything will be revolutionary. No, it's important to keep going down a learning curve so that it's an assurance, it's an insurance policy, and it's very important to do that. Evolution is important. ARPA-E's job, which is, I'm going to come to the history of that, our job was to create entirely new learning curves. So go back to science and try out do R&D based on science for breakthrough technologies that create entirely new learning curves. Early up there, it could be more expensive, it could be less, lower performance, but that's okay. And in the process, you see these crosses, those are failures. That means this is a risky proposition by its very nature because there's no assurance it's going to work. It's an idea. We don't call them failures. We call them opportunities to learn and go back again. But there's a chance that there is one learning curve, like the next generation battery that will make the lithium-ion batteries obsolete, that will go down below in cost and higher performance, that will create an entirely new learning curve, which will be disruptive to the current learning curve in the best sense of the word. And so the idea is that, at least in the United States, is to have the assured path, and you have to have this disruptive path so that the nation as a whole can get the benefit of both, and so that the nation as a whole can go down and have an inflection point and then transition to a new path and keep innovating. Now that the new curve becomes a new learning curve, innovate again and create other new learning curves and keep going. That was the idea, so that you have both of them. Because if you do not innovate, someone else in the world will. But if you go down this path, it costs money. And just to be plain and simple, this is the orders of magnitude. In the early stages where the government supports research, the typical project is a few $1 million, it's 2 to 5 years or so. But when you get to manufacturing, the risk has to be reduced because the capital is higher, and it goes orders of magnitude higher. And so access to low cost and long-term capital, long-term, more than 20 years, because any technology, new technology, will take 15 to 20 years for it to be fully deployed. Access to low-cost, long-term capital is very important. And of course, you need the markets, whether it's a domestic market or global market, you need the markets. And you can have, of course, the businesses, the consumers, the government itself, in the United States at least, is the biggest user of energy. The military is the biggest user of energy. So why not use that as a to prime the system to create to bring some of these technologies down a learning curve. So that's the whole idea. Now, I was asked to give a history of ARPA-E. So let me just do that very quickly. The history goes back to 1957. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched something called Sputnik. And this was a satellite, the first satellite up in the air, and it would beep, and you could pick it up on your radio. And everyone in the United States and the world could hear this. And that sent shockwaves in the United States. Is that now the Soviets would look down upon us, and essentially people could play out all kinds of scenarios. So at that time, it was President Eisenhower. He and others decided that while it is important for us to have a sort of a military angle to this, but maybe this is the time to invest in science and engineering and technology, which is where, if you look at the 60s, beyond Eisenhower, when Kennedy took over, there was a massive expansion in science and engineering. As part of that expansion, there was a new organization that was created in 1958 that reported directly to President Eisenhower called DARPA. And DARPA was asked to do it, to look for quantum leaps in technology, not just incremental. And out of that, over the last 50 years, came out the internet, TCP/IP, and the packet switching technology was created with DARPA. It was called ARPANET before the word internet was created. Stealth technology, this was all started in the 1970s GPS, along with the Air Force and Navy, DARPA got in, created GPS, and now, of course, we have it on all our cell phones and things like that. Those were the quantum leaps. So no pressure on us. We were supposed to do the same for energy. So that was the mandate. So the history goes as follows. Around about 2005 or 2006, there was a committee that was formed called the Rising Above the Gathering Storm Committee that was led by this gentleman, who was Norm Augustine, who was the former chairman and CEO of Lockheed Martin, member of the National Academy of Engineering. And he led a team to look at, he was asked by Congress to look at, tell us where the weaknesses are for the United States. So they wrote this report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm that was happening. That was 2005, 2006, where they made the recommendation that just like we did DARPA in 1958, we need a DARPA for energy, or ARPA-E, because given the gathering storm that are happening in energy and environment and sustainability, we need to take some quantum leaps in technologies, because incremental improvement can only get us so much. So this went into Congress. Congress took that very seriously and created in 2007, under President Bush, and President Bush signed it, what is called the America Competes Act, which authorized, illegally authorized, formation of ARPA-E. But there was no money in it. Now, as some of you know who have been in government, they said you can authorize as much as you want. Unless you put money, nothing really happens. So nothing happened while he was still in office. But then President Obama won, and Secretary Chu was was nominated and confirmed by the Senate to become the Secretary of Energy. Now, it so happens that Secretary Chu was also part of this committee that recommended ARPA-E. And at that time, he didn't wear so many ties, as you can see, and he was smiling more. So he was obviously very interested in now creating ARPA-E, which was then launched in April by the president at the National Academy, and it was launched in April of 2009. And then I got recruited by the president and the secretary and confirmed by the Senate, and by October I was there. So that was the formation, and the mandate was to do what DARPA did for defense and information. You got to do it for energy. So I'm going to give you a few examples of technologies that that we invested in. And if you're interested, I can give you the whole business model of how we went about this agency, because there are some best practices that we found that actually helped us a lot. Let me start with stationary energy systems. How do we produce electricity, and what is the cost? This is a graph from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And there's a lot of details. I just want to highlight a few things. On the x-axis is the cost of producing electricity in dollars per megawatt hour, or you can convert it to cents per kilowatt hour, or rupees per kilowatt hour. The cheapest way to produce electricity in the United States is natural gas combined cycle gas turbine. And these are 60% efficient. Natural gas is dirt cheap, and it costs you about $50 a megawatt hour, or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's the cheapest way to produce electricity. I also highlighted wind. Wind is at about $70 to $80 a megawatt hour, much lower than people had predicted. In fact, I didn't highlight it out here. It is actually cheaper than coal in many parts of the country in the United States, which is amazing. I also highlighted the photovoltaics, which today, at the utility scale, it's at about 114 cents a kilowatt hour, $140, $130 a megawatt hour or so. Now, I also want to highlight very small numbers you will not be able to see, is the ones in green, which is the percentage change over one quarter. This is the third quarter in 2012. And you can find that the PVs dropped 9% in one quarter, which is unheard of. So the cost of producing electricity from solar is going downhill, whereas that from coal and others are essentially stationary. And by the end of the decade, or maybe a few more years, we think this is going to be competing with natural gas combined cycle. And to enable that, we in Department of Energy created something called the Sunshot Initiative. This is what President Kennedy had for the space mission, the moonshot. This is for President Obama. the sun shot. Not to go to the sun and return safely, but to reduce the cost of solar to $1 a watt fully installed, which is about $50 a megawatt hour. And one has to understand where it is coming from. This is the first, the little, the vertical is what happened in 2004. It's $8 a watt. In 2010, it was $3.8 a watt. And we wanted to target $1 a watt, which is about $50 a megawatt hour levelized cost of electricity. And there are three parts to this cost. One is the panel cost, which is the blue. The other is balance of system, installation, permitting, everything else. And then there's the power electronics. And the goal was to reduce the panel cost to 50 cents a watt, to reduce the balance of system to 40 cents and the power electronics to 10 cents. And thereby, you would get $50 a megawatt hour of electricity produced over 25 years or so. It turns out that today, it is already at about 60 cents a watt. So as far as the panel is concerned, we're almost there. The big problem is the balance of system. And balances, so the question is there any technological knob to reduce the balance of system cost? And the answer is yes, there is. And that has to do with efficiency. So if you look at the total dollars per watt cost, it's a manufacturing cost plus installation cost divided by efficiency. So the higher the efficiency, lower the dollars per watt. And so the question is, where are we? So this is what we were going, $1 a watt by 2020, LCOE, levelized cost of electricity, $50 megawatt hour. So where are we today in terms of efficiency? And these are the different technologies. In crystalline silicon production level, it's going on at about 25% today. And the theoretical limit, which those of you who are scientists and engineers will know something called the Shockley-Quasar limit. That is a theoretical limit for a single bandgap semiconductor p-n junction. And that is at about 29. The practical limit is 29%. That is crystalline silicon. Polycrystalline silicon, production level 16% today, 15, 16%, and there's room out there. The cheapest panels today are cadmium telluride. Today, they're at about 14% production level, which is first solar, 14%. And look at the headroom. There's another 14% to go before you reach the theoretical limit. So this cost, the total dollars per watt, is going to come down because perhaps not so much a panel manufacturing cost coming down, but the efficiency going up. And the big trick is, can you get to 25, 26% efficiency at the cost, manufacturing cost of today? And there's a lot of headroom out there. Just to give you one thing that the DOE supported, this is single junction. Multi-junction is a separate story. This is single junction gallium arsenide based. This is at 28% solar cell on plastic substrate. So it's not only just high efficiency, this is on lightweight, which also reduces installation cost, et cetera. This is just coming out of a startup company. So this is pretty amazing stuff happening. Of course, as we know, for solar, you need storage. And the storage target that we had was the target that you can get from pumped hydro. So pumped hydro, pumping water up a dam, the additional charge for storage is about 2 to 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And we said that, why only pumped hydro? Why not compressed air? Why not flow batteries, et cetera? And just to give you one example, we invested in several different technologies. This is one just coming out of MIT, which is spun off into 24M, which is a startup company, which is targeting 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour in terms of battery performance. And this is taking the best of the chemistry of lithium ion in a completely new systems architecture of a flow battery and getting to 1.5 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Even if they get it to 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour, this is a game changer. This is modular, this is small. You can attach it to solar cells, etc. Talking about the grid, electricity grid, for the United States and for any country in developing economy, this is extremely important. In the US, we have about $1 trillion of assets on the grid, and our grid is aging, and which is an opportunity to really do something about it. And occasionally, we have things like this. We have blackouts, okay? And I think from what I hear, India also had some blackouts. So the question is, okay, so you take this approach of a system as a whole and see how can we not only avoid blackouts, but also modernize it so that you can make it smart. And when we say smart, smart means many things to many people. And I won't go too much into detail, But the idea of demand response, supply response, and to automate it and make it real time, and really reduce the cost of electricity and reduce the wastage of electricity. At the end of the day, that's really what matters to consumers, is give me cheaper electricity, give me more reliable electricity, and make it more secure. So just to give you what the aging factor is, here's some data. This is a transformer, a distribution substation transformer, which is 8,000 pounds. It handles about a megawatt of electrical power. It operates at 60 hertz. In India, it would be 50 hertz. It's almost the same technology that Nikola Tesla used 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. In the United States, the average age of these transformers is 42 years. And it's 2 years beyond its projected lifespan. So we are living on the edge in the US. There's a massive asset reallocation that's going to happen in the US. And the question is, are we going to take these old technologies and put it in there, or are we going to invest in new technologies? So just to give you an idea of a new technology very quickly, this is a single transistor made of silicon carbide, which is a semiconductor. It's out of a company called Cree, which can handle 15 kilovolts of voltage, 100 amps, 1.5 megawatts of electrical power. And Cree is now trying to modulate at 50 kilohertz. If you can do that, that 8,000-pound transformer becomes 100 pounds. And this becomes the heart, core of many power conversion technology, power management technology. The other question that one has to ask is the following. Today's grid came from our historic legacy of Tesla and Edison, AC and DC respectively. If solar electricity were the cheapest way to produce electricity during the times of Tesla and Edison, what would the grid look like? And the grid would look very different, because we don't have a centralized electricity generation. It's totally distributed. And so that is the opportunity for many developing economies, we feel, to leapfrog and leverage what we say is the perfect storm of technology and economics, solar, storage, communication, or the 1.5 billion people who do not have access to electricity today, and another 1.5 who have very limited access. So today's grid is one way. You got generation, you may or may not have storage, it's a legacy grid, and goes to all the loads. A future grid may look something like this, that you have a microgrid with people taking essentially extension cards and having generators and loads locally. And these may be tied together and may use the legacy grid as a backup and have local generation. And this is something that I'm doing right now with Google. It turns out the operating system for this grid has not been written yet. How to balance it in real time, how to manage, how to make it robust in terms of changes, how do you maintain frequency at 50 hertz with all loads and supply changing all the time. That is not a trivial problem. So that operating system has not been written. And that's a really technological thing, but of course there's a business opportunity out here. Very quickly on transportation, I'll just give you some major trends. This is where the United States uses its fuel. Light-duty vehicles is about 60%, trucks is about 20%, that's a majority. And those are the options in terms of fuel, gasoline and diesel, natural gas, biofuel, electricity, in terms of powertrain, IC engine, batteries, etc. And today, we are overwhelmingly based on gasoline and diesel and IC engine. And that is changing right now. The biggest change that we have seen is the use of liquefied natural gas in long-haul trucking. And it turns out that you have to have cryogenic tanks for this, and it costs $100,000 to put extra cost for these trucks. But the fuel savings are such, the cost of natural gas is so much lower than diesel, that the fuel savings are $40,000 a year. So 2.5 years, it pays for itself. And fueling station, the payback period is also 2 to 3 years. So the private sector is now putting the network of LNG fueling station every 200 miles so that the long-haul trucks transition to natural gas, to LNG. And this is a major transformation that is happening, which is amazing. The other trend is electrification. And electrification is all about cost and range of electric cars. And so we put out a goal of electric vehicles comparable in range and cost without subsidies in the next 10 years. To do that, it all comes down to the battery. And just to give you an idea, some numbers. Today, the battery cost, current status, is about $600 to $650 per kilowatt hour. and the energy density is about $100, 100 watt hour per kilogram of energy density. It's the density and the cost are the two major factors. If you are to get a 100-mile all-electric vehicle, the cost has to be half, and the energy density has to be double. So it's a factor of 4 totally. And we were wondering whether we'll ever get there. Just this year, there was an announcement by a startup company that we invested, NVIA, which has got a cell-specific energy of 400 watt per kilogram, which is the theoretical limit, approaching the theoretical limit of lithium-ion battery, so that the pack-specific energy is 200 watt per kilogram, which meets the 2022 goals, and the battery cost is about $200 a kilowatt hour, approximately, which matches the 2022 goal. So that battery is already there today in terms of in a lab. But now the question is, can we manufacture it and get into cars? That's happening right now. So this is a major shift. Very quickly about biofuels. All biofuels today are photosynthetic. And if you look at how we make biofuels, we take sugarcane, corn, algae, cellulose. In India, you take jatropha, and we make oil out of it. The problem with biofuels is the following. The conversion efficiency from sunlight to oil is less than 1%. No matter which way you go. It's just the nature of photosynthesis and something called the Calvin cycle. It's less than 1%, which is why you will need a lot of land and a lot of water. And that's why the cost goes up. So this is, I won't go into the details. If you look at what happens, the biofuels, the majority of the cost is feedstock, because it's so dilute. It's in terms of the energy density of oil, the energy density in plants is very just light and fluffy. So the collection of that biomass into a centralized energy dense form is very difficult. You see, in oil, you can put a straw in the ground, and under pressure, the oil comes to you. Plants don't seem to do that. So you have to collect it, which is why in some countries people do this, which is not quite the scalable way. But in Brazil, they've mechanized it, just like they mechanized agriculture. And that's really the way to go. Or you fundamentally change the photosynthetic machinery in a plant, which is where the research that ARPA-E invested is to make photosynthetic much more efficient, which will not only be important for biofuels, but for food. There's another green revolution that Norman Borlaug started that is yet to be made, where you change the photosynthetic machinery and make it much, much more efficient. And that has not happened yet. Or we take a completely different approach, which is what we took in ARPA-E, where we created a completely new approach called electrofuels. It turns out what biology does is it takes carbon dioxide from the air and uses the Calvin cycle, the photosynthetic machinery, to fix carbon dioxide and make carbon-carbon bonds. That's what biology does. But the Calvin cycle, which is associated with photosynthesis, is not the only way. There are many non-photosynthetic microbes that also make carbon-carbon bonds, but they don't live on sunlight and the photosynthetic machinery. So we exploited that in a completely new approach of taking electrons from solar, or hydrogen sulfide, which is the waste product of oil and gas, or feed them hydrogen to these organisms. There are many of them. And if you program them right, it takes carbon dioxide, it lives on electrons, on electrodes, literally, and makes oil. That was the idea. And we realized that this would be 10 times more efficient than photosynthesis. And people thought, this is just nuts. You're going crazy. And we said, let's give it a try. And sure enough, in less than 2 years, this is the first oil, a biofuel that was made without the use of sunlight in darkness, using microbes that could make oil, and they are trying to scale it. I'm going to end in just the last slide with the following. Trying to give a holistic picture of this. I can keep on talking about innovation, but innovation is necessary but not sufficient. And it is very important to look at it holistically. I talked about the R&D to translate science into innovative technologies. That is early stage. And as I said, these have to go into manufacturing, into innovations. They have to manufacture, the cost has to come down, they need to scale up. And you need commercial deployment, and you need markets. And the alignment of all this is extremely important. Okay, if they're not aligned, You can do all the innovation, they'll never reach the market if you don't have the money or if you don't have the markets. The amount of money that you need, as I said, also scales up by orders of magnitude. In the early stages, you can use, at least in the United States, we use government R&D for risky stuff, for research. But later on, for scaling and for deployment, you need the equity or the debt markets, hopefully from the public capital markets in the United States, to invest into the manufacturing and scale up and deployment. But you need the markets to do that. So this has to be looked at holistically. So sometimes, in the United States at least, we do one at a time. But we need to do all of them simultaneously so that everything is lined up and the trains are running. Any blockage of the artery out here will spill over. The innovations will go somewhere else, and we don't get the economic benefit of the investments in the early stage of innovation. So in the United States, we have various ways of creating markets. Some are regulatory signals, some are price signals. A good regulatory signal that the Obama administration has done is what are called the CAFE standards, fuel efficiency standards for transportation, where the signal was sent to the business community that we want 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025, which approximately is 25 kilometers per liter cars, average, corporate average, by 2025. Now that signal is now forcing the auto industry to go towards electrification, to go to lightweighting, to make more efficient engines, etc. And that innovation, actually eventually reduces the cost to the consumer, because that competition is very important. There are financial policies, I won't go into the details. We have a whole list of things. Tax policy, extremely important for public capital to flow into the investment for project finance, etc. And of course, there are other financial policies for manufacturing, etc. So this whole idea of using policy to line up, to align the innovation and manufacturing and markets, extremely, extremely important. And that is something, and I think whichever country does that well will probably benefit a lot from the economic growth of some of these new technologies that are coming. And the countries that do not have the alignment will go in many different directions. So, and that's really the challenge that we have on the policy side to make the alignment proper. So let me stop out here, and thank you so much, and I'll be happy to answer other questions and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Majumdar. You, in fact, ended with perhaps the hardest problem, getting it all aligned up. But you've also given a lot of reason to think how we might get to a situation like that. What are the decisions that have to be taken, and who would be taking it? And it's not going to be one agency, one individual. And if we had to do something like ARPA-E in India, we have to think very hard about who would come together to make this happen. We don't have a Department of Energy. We've got about 8 different ministries dealing with energy. Plus, we've got another 8 or 10 different ministries dealing with water. So I'm sure there are questions, so let's open up the floor. Yes, Dr. Ahuja. There's a microphone coming away.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just want to know how many of these projects that ARPA-E funded were bottom-up and how many were top-down? That means what fraction bubble up from below and come to you, and how many do you go and target and then identify?
All of them are bottom-up. All projects are given based on a proposal that is written. It's a competition. And based on that, based on how they fare in the competition, the awards are made. What ARPA-E does is to provide what I would say the thought leadership. So I recruited people from the scientific community to join ARPA-E as program directors. And some of them provided the thought leadership on refrigeration and air conditioning without the use of refrigerants, which have major global warming potential. So this gentleman who I recruited from Intel came and joined ARPA-E, and he did his research in this whole area, and then he created a program saying that these are the targets I want to reach. I want to create refrigeration at the same cost air conditioning and refrigerating at the same cost as today's air-conditioned refrigerators, but without using HFC at all. Okay? What are the challenges? And then people write proposals, and we look at all of them. And then based on the technical merit and the team, et cetera, we make decisions. So everything is bottom-up in that sense, but the top-down one is to provide the vision, is to provide the analysis saying that this is an area that there is a gap, there's a white space, and this is where we should be going, and get multiple communities, scientific communities, to come together and contribute as a team.
Sir, you had a question. And could I request you to introduce yourself?
My name is Sodi. I'm a former director with Indian Oil Corporation. I just want to know one thing. With the abundant availability of shale gas, will the picture undergo a change?
So I have some more data on shale gas. Shale gas is certainly changing the energy landscape in the United States. It has already changed and has continued to change. Yeah. Chemical manufacturing is coming because shale gas can be used, natural gas can be used as a feedstock for various kinds of polymers and things like that. So that is changing. Certainly the transportation is happening in the trucking. The big question is, can natural gas get into transportation in light-duty vehicles? You know, here it has happened because of Supreme Court mandates, etc. We don't have Supreme Court mandates in the United States. It has to happen based on economic arguments, and one of the big challenges is storage at low cost. And that's where ARPA-E has a new program on just that itself. So that's what will happen. In the electricity sector, you know, we used to get in the United States 50% of electricity used to come from coal and 20-something% used to come from natural gas. This year, for the first time, it is about 33, which we never had anticipated before. So it's already changing based on economic arguments. In the future, we have to be a little careful. There's a lot of euphoria about shale gas. But if you actually look at the data of when you actually drill and horizontal drill and produce gas, there's a peak in production and there's a long tail. We don't know how long the tail really is. So we have to be careful as to how much shale gas can we actually recover from these. We still don't understand how fracking really works down in the mechanics of fracking. We don't know all the details. So I think it's good to have this abundance and low cost, but there's a flip side to it. We may become too complacent, and I think, at least our view, my view is that we need to in parallel look at all the other technologies, but make the best use of our natural resource, make the most efficient use. And we got to do R&D for that.
Why don't we, there were a bunch of questions here. Let's just take them in a bunch and then I'll come to this side.
My name is Kamal Mittal. Nice to meet you after 4
Yes.
years. Delhi government is working on a project to reduce energy by 30% in the next 2 years. And we found that over half the energy which is currently used is used for pumping of water, sewage, or gas. So are there any thoughts which you have which immediately come to your mind on some ideas of how to implement some of those ideas for energy efficiency in Delhi?
Let's just take Amber,
Okay.
you had a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Ambud Sagar from IIT Delhi. Arun, I wanted to do, I guess you had 24M as one of your examples. I'm not sure if it's the same people who brought us A123. But the question I have is, and I think it might be the same group, the question I had is the following. You know, when A123 came out, it looked like this wonder technology. The company's now gone bankrupt. And so the question is, it really is a little bit of balance between the technology, performance and cost envelope. So that's, in a sense, what the technology can offer versus what the markets need to do, or the creation of the markets. Right now, the markets, the demand pool is really not there in a strong way to be able to pull technologies like that into large-scale commercialization. So I just want to get a feel of how do you see
Sure.
this balance playing out?
Right. Let me answer Kamal's questions first. In terms of efficiency for motors and pumps, there are many aspects to this. The technological side is that there is, we're probably seeing the renaissance of power electronics that is happening. Wide bandgap semiconductors, use of that for high frequency switching, AC to AC, DC to DC, efficient is coming on board. And once you have power electronics, you can design much more efficient motors, which has not happened. And today, most of the motors are either induction motors or permanent magnet motors. And you can get into something like switch reluctance motors. And I won't go into the details of that. But those can be much, much more efficient. And I think that's an technological opportunity out there. But there's also the opportunity of, from energy efficiency side, when you're talking about appliances, is to create the market for it, which is, in the United States, we've done things like appliance standards. Appliance standards are one of the most cost-effective ways to introduce energy efficiency. Because what you do is you say that this is the bottom line. You can't go below this in terms of performance. And if they're carefully done, not only does it reduce the overall life cycle cost, it actually reduces the purchase price. People think that regulation increases the price, increases the cost to the consumer. It is actually just the opposite. Let me share with you some data on this. This is, it's worth pointing that out. Where is the data on that? Here. You see, this is refrigerators, room air conditioners. The blue data is the life cycle cost of energy. And the red data is the first cost to a consumer. Okay? And these arrows, the dash arrow is when the appliance standards was introduced in California. And then the solid arrow is when the federal, in the United States, the federal standards were introduced. And what is not surprising is that the life cycle cost comes down because you make it more and more efficient, it uses less electricity. What is really surprising is that the first purchase price or the first cost to the consumer also comes down. And I think that's where, where I think the judicious use of standards, where it is a slightly stretch goal, can really introduce cost reduction, which at the end of the day, consumers, that's what they want to see. Okay? So that's just the answer. Now coming to Ambuj's question, A123, yes, it is Yetmin Chiang, who was the founder, who was the scientist behind A123. A123's failure, has to be looked at, has to be analyzed properly. In the battery world, I won't go into the details of the battery world, there are many horizontals. Okay? There is the innovative materials, the people who make the materials, people who design the materials, people who make cells, and people who package them. And in any industry, there are horizontals and verticals. When the industry is horizontal, and if you try to be vertical, you have some problems that you got to encounter. So just because someone has innovated doesn't mean that it's going to become a success, because you got to have the right business strategy, not just the market. You got to have the right business strategy to exploit the market. So I think one has to look at A123's failure to see what went wrong and whether there was some technological gaps as well, or whether it was a strategy, whether it was the market. And I think that the jury is still out on that. The 24M one is, yes, it is a wonderful technology. We hope it is successful. We don't know. It depends on the team's business strategy and what the market is like. And the markets need to be created because at some point someone will come up with a good business strategy to monetize it properly. And that is what we, the government, I'm talking about we, the government, is to really create that playing field, a level playing field for the markets to be created, and let people figure out business models. And in any transition of technology, going back in history in the early 1900s, late 1800s or so, there were many technologies that failed and many technologies that succeeded. Look at the history of Standard Oil. Okay, there are a lot of things that gobbled up, and that happens. And some will fail, some will succeed.
Before we come this side, I'm going to abuse the position of the chair by posing a slightly less technical but a more political question to both Mr. Prabhu and to you, Dr. Majumdar. In your paper with Secretary Chu that you started off with, you have a telling observation where you suggest that in the last year, about 99% of the oil that was consumed globally crossed national borders. Effectively, that means oil has always been an energy security issue, but that number just puts the stamp on it. The question I have for you is, when you were describing the origins of ARPA-E and the sort of scare that came from Sputnik's launch, what were the sort of driving forces that the 2006 report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, mentioned? Was it really about, as you mentioned in your talk, if we don't innovate, someone else will? Or was it that this is really an energy security issue, not just a technology issue? The question I have, a similar question I have for you, Mr. Prabhu, if we were to do something like this in India, what would be the driver? Would it be, let's try and get onto the technological bandwagon and see which would be the niche areas that we could focus on? Or is there a different, bigger political message that needs to come to get a number of different government agencies to see the potential and the reason behind doing something like this?
So, I mean, I look at it this way. When we say that innovation in energy technology will take 20 years to really make an impact, you have to think about what's the world we're going to leave our children and grandchildren, okay? And the issue is, how can we provide security of their future? And there are three securities in that. One is national security that you were addressing. The other is economic security. That means, can we create economic growth so that people get jobs and have a better quality of life than their parents did? And the third one is environmental security. So these are the three securities, and that will ensure our kids, children and grandchildren security. At the foundation of these all are innovations in energy technology. So innovations are absolutely key for both economic growth, national security, or environmental security. Now, sometimes, as we are seeing now in the United States, our oil imports are actually going down. Okay, that's partly because our economy is not picking up as fast, but also we are producing more oil domestically, and we're likely to produce more. So we may say that national security problem is not as much. Well, it's still there. We still import 45% of our oil. That's a big deal in terms of not only national security, but also our balance of trade. So it's an economic one as well, and of course, an environmental one. So many of these cases have these three-pronged security challenges that we have to address. Some of them have two, which is fine. Some of them have one, but you still, the innovation in energy technology. So now the question is, okay, well, with the science and engineering infrastructure that we have in the United States, do we have the capacity to innovate? And the answer is, yeah, I think we can. If you have the right investment, if they have the right strategy, yes, we can. So then the question is, well, if you don't invest in that, someone else will. And we may not get the economic benefit of that, someone else might. So it's a competitiveness issue, but it's a cooperative issue as well. So I think that's the approach that we are taking.
No, I think it will be quite a few factors. Of course, all of that will influence India's decision making on that. But look at some of the localized issues. One is Naxalite problem in India, which we have always overlooked. And that problem is now almost in 1/3 of the country, 200 districts. So essentially, if you want to really bring about economic development in that part, that's the only way we can address it on a long-term basis. We'll have to give electricity, and that is impossible, inconceivable that that part of the country where this problem is so rampant will be able to actually give grid-connected electricity. So we'll have to think about different ideas about how to take electricity there, because without that, economic development will not take place, and without that, social issues like Naxalite issues can never be addressed. So that will be one trigger that will come from the social perspective. The second one is the same, as you mentioned, the macroeconomic issue. In fact, today, one of the reasons why the monetary policy has failed to arrest inflation, despite increasing interest rates, is also the pressure on the currency itself. The rupee is depreciating so fast, and the result, the real intrinsic reason for that is something that our trade deficit is so high, and that trade deficit finally gets into the current account deficit, and current account deficit being now close to 3% of GDP, it is inconceivable that rupee will be stabilized. So that again will be pushing us, because if you don't control the fall of rupee, it will have so much of adverse impact on so many other sectors, including inflation. So India cannot afford to have the inflation at this level. So that would also mean that we'll have to reduce the trade deficit by diversifying our energy basket. And I think the third one, which will essentially be coming from, actually now it is all people are watching television and everything else. So they really want to have the type of electricity that people want. In fact, in Mumbai, where it's really an island. But Mumbai people think that it is their birthright to have 24/7 power, because they forget that just cross Mumbai's border, just about 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers from Mumbai, they don't get 24/7 power. But now they want it because they are used it. And because Mumbai is using it, the next door neighbor also wants it. So I think after some time, everybody is going to demand that electricity. And it is impossible that we can actually cater to that demand by importing oil or by gas or by doing something else. So this will actually be essentially coming from some domestic solution. What is the local resource available? I think there, unfortunately, we are missing a very important opportunity. Like if you collaborate on some of these research, need not be fundamental and basic research. Like if you can improve the efficiency of PV to some 28-29%, which is in the realm of reality in the next few years' time, will be the biggest beneficiary because we have the highest sunlight. Now there, we could use some of this opportunity. I was just talking to Minister Farooq Abdullah only in the noon time actually. I think that was the right time to discuss that issue because noon time is the time when the radiation is highest. So I was telling Dr. Abdullah, why not we create a solar energy club of those countries who have more than 300 days of sunshine and therefore the radiation is high. And therefore if we make a club like the OPEC and try to generate solar energy, we'll be benefiting from the technological innovation that you are doing it because we are the market, because we are the sun. You cannot produce solar energy without sun. We have it. So I think that could be another trigger in terms of making available the technological innovations, inventions and innovation taking place outside. How can we integrate them into the country? But I think we are in a way advantageous position now because in India we normally only react to a crisis. So I think when crisis comes, we should be very happy that now crisis is coming. So I think some solutions will happen.
You've been waiting for a long time, sir. Why don't you put your question across, then Padhu, I'll come to you. Then I'll come to you, Dr. Kapoor. And
My question connects to all three.
Could you also introduce yourself?
My name is Ravi Kaimal. I'm an architect by training, but involved in various things, including a CII Water Institute. What I have seen, especially in India, is that the genuine user, somebody who owns, let's say, a building or a property and uses it, invest in these technologies to make themselves independent of the grid and not be crippled by a grid outage or a water shortage. This is already happening even with the low efficiency existing technologies. But at the commercial developer end, A, they don't believe in global warming. B, they don't care because the tenant pays the energy bills and the water bills. So we find consistently that they don't even accept the idea of putting in cheap insulation into the buildings. That's at the top end. So it all connects up to finance, and this is illustrated very graphically at the bottom end by an NGO which has been working in rural areas in the private sector, who discovered that the key is to be able to supply the energy at a reasonable cost, and that translated into renting the battery for the evening when the light was on, as opposed to investing in the systems and all the rest of it. So the essence of it is that the finance has to push, and till that happens, till the banks tell the big developers, till some local guy finances the battery or whatever, it's not going to happen. But the need is there, the pull is there, it is getting stuck for a few rupees at the bottom end and millions of rupees at the top end. So.
Padhu, you had a question.
Padmanabhan from USAID. Arun, excellent presentation. Coming back to ARPA-E, Arun, one way of looking at ARPA-E was that you have within the government system developed a process to accelerate the pace of market-driven R&D in a short period of time. So what would normally have taken 10, 15, 20 years, if at all, you are able to collapse it within a time frame of maybe 1, 2, or 3 years. I guess when you do that, you're up against an issue. Do you back bleeding edge technologies or cutting edge technologies, or does it matter at all? Because if it's bleeding edge technologies, then there's a huge cost involved. It's not going to get commercialized that easily. And of course, cutting edge technologies means the risks are much less. So did you come across that issue, or is it an issue at all?
Well, it's actually, it could be an issue unless you define what ARPA-E's goal is before others defined it for us. And we made a specific point that we will look for white space, as I mentioned, which is a gap in technology and as I described, that will create entirely new learning curves. We will not do incremental work down a current learning curve, even though it's the bleeding edge. We are very clear, because not only would it be the identity crisis for ARPA-E, it will actually infringe upon what the rest of the DOE is doing. And there's an internal issue then. And so we had to partner. So I mean, this is the, when DARPA was formed in 1958, all the other service labs were trying to kill DARPA. And we were quite aware of that, when ARPA-E was formed. So we had to make sure that ARPA-E's role was very unique and specific, and so that other parts of the Department of Energy actually benefited from what we did. And so that was, so bleeding edge and cutting edge, whichever way you define it, it was the idea that we will not go down a current learning curve, we will create entirely new learning curves. And that's, we stuck to that.
Let's take two more questions. Dr. Kapoor, you had a question there.
Before I chair CII's task force on solar, you very elegantly spelled out, the linkage between energy and economic growth through all your very fantastic exponential curves. The challenge in India is, and I think Mr. Prabhu talked about it, is rural India, where 70% of India lives, and it's quite clear that we're not going to be able to take the grid over there. Yet, electricity, from our Electricity Act, it's a universal service obligation, so we have to be able to supply power in rural India at the same kinds of prices as which we supply the rest of the country. Not at the kind of lighting prices you're talking about, where you're giving 4 watts of electricity, it's costing 15 rupees, but the poor guy is paying 5 rupees. So he compares it to the cost of kerosene and he finds it acceptable, but not enough for economic activity. Arising out of the kinds of things you are doing, and I'm talking now about those parts of the country, rural India, where grid will not reach.
Yes.
Right? What kind of solutions do you see, or what kind of collaboration do you see that we can, do what we did with mobile telephones to landlines,
right,
and the big grid to rural India?
Well, that's part of the reason. We had a discussion earlier this morning with Dr. Ghosh and Mr. Prabhu, and sort of provoked me to put this particular slide in this talk of this. That is, this grid that you're talking about on the left-hand side is not going to reach, or let's put it this, I hate to use these firm terms, unlikely to reach many of the remote areas who are far away from the grid, which has provoked our work in Google right now to look for, see, everyone who works on the grid takes today's architecture and tries to improve it. Whereas the approach we're taking is that let's forget today's architecture, because if solar were available during Tesla's time, the grid would look very different. And it might look something like that, that you have multiple generators. So you want to lay out a wire almost like an extension cord, okay, still be very efficient, and you can put multiple solar panels, multiple loads on it, and it has to balance in real time, and that's not trivial, okay. And that technology, the operating system for a grid, because an individual like me or anyone else cannot, turn on generators and in a fraction of a second. You see, the grid today that we have, you can turn on a switch and turn off a switch without changing the rest of the grid, because the grid has inertia. Okay, there are rotating machinery on it, which has enough inertia that it's not going to collapse. Imagine if you had a solar panel and LED lighting somewhere else on the grid. It has no inertia. And if you turn off something and turn on something, it changes the grid. And the grid has to balance itself in an automated way, because I cannot respond that quick. No one else can. No one can. That operating system, the technology for that, does not exist today in a distributed way. And that is where we are focusing on right now. And we're trying to get the best minds to work on this, because it's a nonlinear problem. Power and voltage are nonlinear relationships. So trying to maintain a voltage or a frequency or a VAR at a certain location and doing it in a balanced way, as I said, is a technology that we need to develop for distributed new architectures, which is something like this. And that's what we're trying to do right now.
This is
technological solution to be able to provide to generate power like what we're talking about, in a distributed manner, which is cost effective and compares with the cost of grid power today.
Right.
So do you see opportunities like
Absolutely.
what
I mean, the solar today, if you look at the grid out here in India, it's what, 10 rupees, 7 rupees, 6 rupees a kilowatt hour. Okay. Now you will get to that level by solar, I would say pretty soon. If there's, in the next, within this decade, we should be able to get to that level, by using solar. And some of the cheap solar panels from China, the efficiency actually is going to go up in the future. So that's the opportunity that we have. And not only that backed up by, there are diesel gensets that can still be used. They're more expensive, but when the sunlight is not, that balancing act has to be done. But I think solar will be cheap.
I'm afraid we have time for only one last question. I'm going in order of those who put up their hands. So on the front row.
Arun, my question is based on your last slide that you put up, which is innovation has to be supported by policy and markets and demand. What is happening today is U.S. has lots of innovations going on, but the manufacturing is happening somewhere else, from First Solar to any companies. How can we try and see that we have this full cycle, end-to-end life cycle, value chain that can be created in U.S. and maybe U.S. and India tries to do something? Because what I see from our side is China taking over in this. They may not have, currently they may not have a lot of innovation going on, but a lot of the manufacturing and maybe even the markets are happening there.
You see, if I'm a businessman, I want to get my cost down as much as possible. And if China is providing a service where they already have an ecosystem of a certain amount of manufacturing, I will go to China and get it manufactured. Which is what is happening. And I think it is, I would say, it is too much to expect all of manufacturing being in one country. That is unlikely to happen. I think what we'll see is global supply chains. And when you have global supply chains, what the United States should do is, in that global supply chain, where's the biggest value that R&D can contribute that others cannot? Where the biggest margins are, the biggest values, and see whether we can keep those parts of the manufacturing, not the nuts and screws, which have low margins, you need lots of it, but the high-end part of it, whether we can keep that. And that requires some strategy in investments and creating the markets. So if I were to create windmills in the United States, let's say, I have to create the demand for it, okay? Because they're so big that it's unlikely to be shipped from China. So if I create the market for it, most likely the manufacturing will happen out there, okay, in the United States. So that's a demand creating thing that will create the manufacturing out there. Some things are lighter, okay, they may be manufactured somewhere else, but then there are other policies that one can introduce. So manufacturing is an interesting, I mean, there are lots of angles to it. You need the skill sets. And there are jobs, manufacturing jobs in the United States right now, but they're not getting filled because the skills are not there. So there's a human capital side to it. There's a finance side to it. The capital needs to be available at low cost. So it's a multivariable problem, which I'm not sure at least I'm wearing my US hat. I don't know what's going on as much as in India. But in the US, we have not, I would say, done a good enough job in coming up with a strategy to promote manufacturing. We need to do much more. We have done some things, but not enough, I think.
And I think that's where we are working on, and we'd like to probably share some thoughts, because if we do not do this, I think this century is going to become a China-dominant society.
Mr. Prabhu, a final comment from you?
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So Dr. Majumdar, thanks a lot, and all of you for participating in this debate and a dialogue to find out how we can really move on. I think for India, we really have a great opportunity here because even 44% of the households do not have electricity. And even at least 30% of the remaining do not have assured electricity. So in fact, we really need to find a solution, and it could be a time when such new ideas can actually be incorporated, particularly in the distributed generation. And you mentioned about Electricity Act 2003. So we seldom talk about that act in terms of generation, but there is also a huge space devoted to talk about distributed generation. So I think there is a legislative framework already available to make it happen. Now, to bring in innovation and invention, we really need signals. One signal can come from market, but the other signal, and a very strong one, can come from policy. So I think before we develop a market, I think if we can start with policy as an initiation, and we really make a policy in India, keeping in mind not just the type of policy that we made last time, what are the local resources available? Based on that, how can we create an energy future for the country? And there I think renewables will stand out, obviously, because that's the only resource which is available in abundance. Solar is there. Also wind, we have got now 650,000 megawatts of possible potential in solar, in wind. Also probably we are not even included offshore wind. So if you include that, could it again be higher? So if you can actually make starting point of a policy which begins with this and build up an architecture on that, and actually the policy follows, I'm sure the innovation will also come in. But I really look forward to this. And in fact, if you really look at it, if all the innovations, invention take place in US and also the manufacturing take place in US, probably nobody's going to buy those products because the market will be outside of the US, particularly in India. So probably it's a time to have invention there probably, but also to have the collaboration in which probably the manufacturing can take place in India for catering to the domestic market. So I think that could be a very good point that we can work on. So thank you very much for joining in, and I think I give it to Arunabha to make some closing thoughts. Thank you.
I don't have to make any closing thoughts. Thanks to both Dr. Majumdar and Mr. Prabhu. And thanks to the Aspen team and the CW team for putting this together. It's been a great week for us. Last Thursday, we had the British Chief Scientific Advisor speaking on food, energy, and water security. Then we had Amory Lovins from the Rocky Mountain Institute. And today, Dr. Majumdar. So it's a great week to cap it all. And I'm sure you have more burning questions, which we can take over tea. Thank you.